Football, hockey, and rugby are tough sports, that's true. But compared to the other bits of organized brutality we've put our athletes through in the past, these sports are mere gentle pillow fights. Here now are 10 of the most brutal and savage sports in our history. As a general rule, Vikings were happiest when either risking their own violent death or causing someone else's. This extended even to their sporting events, such as Viking skin pulling. About the only good thing you can say about this game is that they are not actually pulling on each other's skin. Everything else, however, is pure brutality. At its core, it's just tug of war. Two teams grab a thick rope made out of animal skin and attempt to pull the other side over the middle. But while we play tug of war over water or sand, the Vikings preferred to play over a large open flame. So if you lost a game of Viking skin pulling, you were likely roasted alive. Even the prizes were awful. The winning Vikings got to keep the losing Vikings' plunder, which often included women whom they would enslave and then do unspeakable things to. Think about that next time you lose a friendly game of tug of war and have to buy the winning team some beers. You're lucky. Have you ever watched soccer, rugby, football, or wrestling and wished there weren't so many dang rules? If so, head on over to Florence, Italy for a rousing game of Calcio Storico, or rather a rousing fight of Calcio Storico. Calcio Storico started in 1580 as a way for Florentinians to test their mettle and prove themselves the greatest athlete in the city. The basic goal is like soccer and rugby: get the ball through your opponent's goal. But to accomplish this, you can resort to almost anything you want. Aside from head kicks and sucker punches, anything is fair game, including punching, headbutts, choking, tripping, and otherwise mangling your opponent. In fact, that's pretty much the only strategy. It's a lot easier to score a goal if the entire opposing team is lying around in writhing heaps of agony. So usually, the team that totally decimates the other side first ends up the winner. With such a strategy, if you can call it that, it's probably no surprise to hear that most people cannot play more than 2 games of Calcio Storico a year. They spend the other 363 days recovering from all their injuries. We all know about medieval jousting, and that could be plenty brutal, but usually those knights got knocked off their horses and fell onto sand or gravel at worst. It might sting a bit, but overall it sounds pretty cushy. Ancient Egyptian fishermen, meanwhile, had a different take on the whole jousting thing. In their version, participants would stand up on a rowboat with a large sharp stick. When they weren't using the stick to row the boat, they were using it to stab the other participants or knock them off their boat. That would be bad enough, but these were not contained waters. These were wild rivers, usually filled with crocodiles and hippopotami, and the blood that spilled during the game's stabbing sessions made them extremely hungry. So if you fell into that river, you probably weren't making it out. We love to romanticize ancient Egypt as being this advanced civilization far beyond their time. But then we learn they did things like fishermen jousting in croc-infested waters, and you have to wonder how advanced they really were. Now, Machia isn't just one of the most brutal sports in history, it's also one of the strangest. It is literally nothing more than a simulated naval battle, only with real ships and real lives. Devised in ancient Rome during the reign of Julius Caesar, Naumachia saw dozens and possibly up to 100 warships placed in a flooded amphitheater. The ship's inhabitants were tasked with destroying the other ships. We're being completely literal here. They had to use real weapons and real violence to legitimately sink and destroy every other ship in their path. Did the people on these doomed ships die terribly? Absolutely they did. The vast majority of them were slaves, and thus their lives meant very little to both the ruling class and the spectators watching. Thankfully, modern technology means that we can stage our own Naumachia anytime we want, simply by firing up our favorite video game. Sinking ships and murdering sailors in Assassin's Creed is infinitely preferable to doing so at the whim of whatever Caesar happened to be sitting on the throne at the moment. Traditional bobsledding certainly has its dangers if you crash or topple into the snow at a high speed, but an ancient Hawaiian version called He'eholua takes that danger to a whole new stratosphere. Obviously, Hawaii doesn't get much snow, but a long time ago, Hawaiians decided they wanted to bobsled anyway. And so they did, only their paths were made out of solidified lava flows or collected lava rocks. If a volcano wasn't handy, they would simply use other rocks and make their own path out of that. Either way, bobsledding down a bunch of rocks at up to 80 miles an hour is horrifically dangerous. Nightmarish injuries up to and including shredded faces were commonplace. It didn't help that, as far as we know, the sleds used were extremely basic and had no real braking mechanisms. The only way to stop was to make it to the bottom of the extremely long and steep track, which sometimes did not end until it met the Pacific Ocean. That's a long time to go shrieking down a mountain while desperately praying to the volcano gods that they protect your face. If you don't live in Afghanistan, Buzkashi will probably sound like the weirdest, most primitive sport modern humans still play. If you're Afghani, however, this is likely both your national sport and among your most cherished traditions. At its heart, buzkashi is like polo. You ride a horse and try to get the ball across the field and into the goal. But here's the thing, buzkashi has no ball. Instead, you pick up a heavy goat carcass and ride that across the goal. Yes, it is a real goat, not a mannequin. Part of buzkashi tradition involves ritually sacrificing a goat before each game. The goat gets its throat slit, bleeds out, loses its head and hooves, and then becomes the MacGuffin in that day's festivities. But the game isn't just brutal for the goat. It's an utter free-for-all, with dozens of athletes charging around on ferocious horses, whipping both the horses and each other in an attempt to steal the goat and score for themselves. If you fall off your horse, or more likely get knocked off, you risk getting trampled, possibly to death. Don't think for a second that buzkashi has grown more gentle with the times either. It is still the exact same game, played in nearly the exact same way as it was hundreds of years ago. The only real difference is that the winner can now take a selfie with the goat carcass and upload it to Facebook while bragging about how they totally wrecked the opposition. With a lot of brutal sports, bloodshed is merely a side effect of the inherent violence. With pasola, however, the bloodshed was the point. On the small island of Sumba around Indonesia exists a sporting tradition called pasola. Once game time begins, everyone rides around on horseback while carrying long spears. The goal is to knock your opponents off their steed, and when one person remains on their horse, they're the winner. It's like polo crossed with a pro wrestling battle royale. There once was another goal as well: spill as much blood as possible. This is because more than just being a sport, pasola is a spiritual ritual. Its goal is to ensure the rice harvest is good that year. Participants spilled each other's blood because doing so was believed to both satisfy the spirits and fertilize the soil so the rice can grow. If you couldn't win ancient pasola, the next best thing to do was die. We're being serious here. If you died during pasola, that was actually considered an extremely good thing. You had done an honorable deed by spilling your blood and giving your life for harvest, and for the good of your people. Sumba still plays pasola today, but injuries are rare, and death even rarer. Participants still have their spears, but now those spears are dull and missing metal tips. Interestingly enough, even with little to no bloodshed during the game, rice still grows. Imagine that. Not all brutal sports come from ancient times. The Japanese, for example, invented botaushi shortly after World War II, long after they should have known better. The goal in botaushi is simple and straightforward. One side guards a pole while the other side tries to bend the pole over. It sounds a little bit like capture the flag, right? If only. In botaushi, each team is comprised of 150 players, with complete freedom to attack or defend the pole in any way they see fit. Aside from literal murder, absolutely nothing is off limits. At least we presume murder is off limits. Other than that, you can brutalize your opponent however you see fit. And since players have nothing but a simple padded helmet to protect themselves, everybody is fair game for violence of any kind. If botaushi sounds less like a sport and more like an epic bloody battle straight out of Braveheart or Game of Thrones, you're right. But the Japanese would have it no other way. Today's Ultimate Fighting Championship is a sleek, sophisticated, and organized combat sport that rakes in billions of dollars a year. But when the UFC launched in 1993, bouts were little more than glorified street fights. The UFC's early days featured no weight classes, few truly trained athletes, no gear specifications, no time limits, no judges, and no rules. You could do literally anything you wanted to beat down your opponent. Even the few banned moves, such as groin shots, only resulted in a small fine that many were more than willing to pay if it meant securing the prize money. For a while, referees could not even stop the fights. If one athlete was getting completely decimated but did not submit, the fight went on until they did, or more likely their cornerman did. Such savagery resulted in the UFC being deemed human cockfighting by Senator John McCain. After those comments, 36 states banned mixed martial arts, and the UFC finally took steps to modernize their sport. By 1999's UFC 21 event, most of today's rules were in place, and the product presented itself much like it does today. However, it still took several years before many states felt comfortable enough to lift their MMA bans. In 2016, New York became the final state to legalize MMA, mostly because by that point the UFC had become so valuable that to not allow it within your borders was akin to setting millions of dollars on fire. Movies such as Gladiator make being a gladiator seem kind of romantic. In truth, it was anything but, and in many cases was more of a glorified execution barely dressed up as a sporting event. If you were a gladiator in the Roman Republic or Empire, your days were numbered no matter how good you were. Your job was to go into a stadium in front of thousands of cheering or jeering fans and violently face down your opponent. This opponent could be another gladiator, but most likely it was an incredibly bloodthirsty and starving animal, such as a lion. The elite gladiators were treated as heroes and celebrated in death, but that still means they were eaten by a lion while on the job. A far worse fate met the non-elite. Many gladiators were slaves or condemned criminals, thrown into the Colosseum to fight an angry warrior or a ferocious beast because that's all they deserved in everyone else's eyes. Once they perished, they were shunned and segregated, even in burial. For people like that, being a gladiator was both physically and psychologically brutal.